Sadly, there's no dog train a la Cat Bus from My Neighbor Totoro.
I just showed that to my daughter. She's finally old enough for it.
She's old enough for it. I don't know. Is there anything too threatening in My Neighbor Totoro?
Well, here's something I forgot about it. They talk a lot about their mom dying.
Did you turn to your daughter and say, "That'll be me someday"?
Basically.
This time we watch Season 5, Episode 9, The Girl in Lover's Lane.
Where we learn that drifters and prostitutes don't mix.
No. And also, don't ever go on a date with character actor Jack Elam. It won't go well.
Oh my, does it ever not go well. This is a dark movie, guys, but we'll get into that. First...
Yes, we have some follow-up. Exciting letter follow-up.
Yes, we're getting some lovely letters lately, and thank you so much for the people who have taken the time.
Yep, for all those postcards that have come in marked ear hustle, please stop sending those to us. But Beth, what did this lovely letter have to say?
Chad from Seattle writes, I've always wanted to go to Seattle, by the way. It seems like my kind of city.
I've heard good things about their tossed salads and scrambled eggs.
It sounds like it's very rainy, and that just kind of suits my mood perfectly most of the time.
Oh, you're one of those garbage types who's only happy when it rains.
Chad says, great episode on the Deadly Mantis. Y'all did an excellent job analyzing what drove the 1950s big bug movie craze. The only insight I can add is the curious comparison to the 1990s. That post-Cold War, pre-9/11 period when Western films could no longer use communism or nuclear weapons as a go-to villain, but had not yet experienced global terrorism. As a result, filmmakers in the 1990s had to invent new threats, many of which were either retreads from earlier eras, like dinosaurs, aliens, or in the case of Future War, dinosaurs and aliens, exotic sci-fi fantasy, asteroids, meteorites, and Bruce Willis, or just goofy. I've personally never seen a volcano in Los Angeles. The rise of inventive villains in the post-Soviet era paralleled the demise of James Bond.
There is a particularly weird thing in the 90s where they're struggling to find good villains for James Bond movies, like when they made Jonathan Pryce the villain in the second Pierce Brosnan film, and he's just essentially Rupert Murdoch, so I guess that fits to be a big bad guy, and he's starting World War III just because he wants the ratings.
Yeah, I mean, and there were, even in the 90s, I can just remember True Lives, the bad guy there was basically... an Islamic terrorist. So it was in the soup, I suppose, but it hadn't become the big bad that eventually comes after 9/11. But I think it's a really good observation that in the 90s, with the lack of like a superpower to kind of turn all our respective monster fears towards, we instead got really scared of nature. That was something I forgot to bring up in the last episode. Mostly in the 50s, you see them encountering and conquering nature in some form. But in the 90s, there's some pushback from nature. And you start to see things like Twister and Dante's Peak. And what was the other one?
Well, Volcano and Dante's Peak, he sort of referenced in the letter.
Yeah, and then there's, there's Armageddon, and then there's Deep Impact.
Yep.
So this idea of going head-to-head with nature becomes a big theme in the 1990s.
And I think you'll find that nature gone amok cycles tend to happen every 2 decades anyway, because in the 50s there's a nature run amok film out every week, and in the 70s the same thing happened, I think climaxing gloriously with 2 movies. There was Day of the Dolphin, which has the immortal poster of George C. Scott, where the quote attributed to Scott's character is, "I trained a dolphin to kill the president of the United States." One of my own personal favorite nature run amok movies is Day of the Animals, in which Leslie Nielsen, pre-comedy mode, strips down to his skivvies and screams, "I believe in Melville's God," before wrestling with a bear.
Oh, and that actually made me think, like Waterworld. That's basically, humans living in like a very hostile nature to some extent, which was also from the 90s. So there maybe was some climate change anxiety going on there, which did not get us to actually do anything about it, but still it was there.
No, people were too busy focusing on the "did he just drink his own pee" scene from Waterworld.
I wonder if that movie is better than we remember. Probably not.
No, it's not. It really sucks.
Well, should we talk about this particular piece of dreck?
Yes, let's hop a freight and get to Lover's Lane.
All right, let's dive into... get it? Dive? That was a great segue, Beth. Let's dive into Season 5, Episode 9, The Girl in Lover's Lane. Ah, yes, trains, the nerve centers of mid-century human misery, apparently. The film opens on a young, freight-hopping man attempting to evade some toughs, and he throws his wallet in one of the cars in order to save it from the thieves. It works. The bullies just knock him out instead. He comes to inside the moving car, being watched by a not at all creepy older man who introduces himself as Bix Dugan, or Big Stupid as he comes to be known. We learn the young man is named Danny, a runaway who convinces Bix to show him the ropes of transient life in exchange for financial support. They meander into a nightmarish small town named Sherman, where Bix continues his leering, but this time at a fragile-looking waitress named Carrie Anders, who very much appreciates his attention. In the meantime, Bix's tutelage of Danny continues. He saves him from a predatory prostitute, shows how to turn an unfair fight in one's favor, and encourages him to be emotionally vulnerable with another man while stripping down to his boxers. Bix continues his seduction of Carrie, but soon realizes she's a good girl and deserves to be treated with more respect. Meanwhile, at Carrie's behest, her father offers Bix and Danny jobs at his diner. Could Rolling Stone Bix Dugan finally be settling down? Carrie sure hopes so, particularly since he's so good at rebuffing the advances of local creep Jesse, played by Jack Elam. But Bix gets cold feet, and he later announces to Danny that they're going to leave town by the end of the week. Carrie runs to the local river to cry, where Jesse finds her, and we have to assume rapes her, and when Bix finds her, she is dying. Of course, Bix is accused of the murder, and suddenly the non-existent local law enforcement shows up. Bix is too grief-stricken to defend himself, which becomes a problem when a local mob, led by Carrie's father, comes to lynch him. It turns out Danny is the savior this time as he forces Jesse to confess to his crime. The film ends with Danny calling his father to announce that he's coming home with a new friend.
Well, freight hopping is dangerous, but being on a satellite in outer space, that's just fun. We open with Tom and Crow drilling belly buttons into their waist sections. Joel freaks out at first, but warms to the idea of belly button bots. After the break, the bots have mixed feelings about their newfangled gut holes. We then cut to Deep 13, where Dr. Forrester and TV's Frank unveil their newest evil idea, baseball theme nights. Dr. Forrester promises pain with brass knuckles given to a select group of children, while Frank brings an ill-thought-out poopy night to the table. Joel and the bots present the far more benevolent, punny invention of Don Martin boots, based on the similarities between the name of a famous footwear manufacturer and the Mad Magazine cartoonist best known for drawing silly footwear. Joel's foot modeling is highlighted by some lovely comic book-style captions made out of cardboard. The second segment sees Joel and the bots sporting guitars and singing What a Pleasant Journey, aka the train song. Their charming ode to freight hopping is cut short when Joel decides they're less the boxcar riding type and more like Gary Newman. Why Newman? Because Joel and the bots like to rock out in cars! Crow and Tom haul up the SOL's pinball machine as a trap for Joel in segment 3. Inspired by seeing the movie, they conspire to beat Joel up for quarters. Joel sees through their ruse, so Crow asks permission to beat him up. Joel declines, so the bots tackle him anyway. In segment 4, Crow goes full Jack Elam, recreating the actor's slicked back hair and wall-eyed face. Joel and Tom Servo are busy with their grade school level science experiment to create enough heat in a jar to suck an egg through the spout. As such, neither Joel nor Tom is taken with Crow's incredible Elam getup. Enraged by the movie in the final segment, Crow and Tom rewrite the ending to feature aliens and pygmies, while Joel reads viewer mail. One letter suggests an invention exchange idea, a garbage disposal trash can. Another letter rates the show 100 plus 100 equals 200, while the last one comes from a viewer protesting the many times Crow gets timeouts for being sassy. In Deep 13, Frank suggests an alternate ending to The Girl in Lover's Lane in which Big Stupid is pure energy, foreshadowing MST3K's Season 7 finale. Dr. F, having none of it, bludgeons Frank with a hammer. This was one of a handful of episodes selected for Collection 2, released on Netflix. They've swapped the original episodes that were available. Do you think this would be good for someone trying to dip their toe into the show?
The movie itself is a bit of a slog, as this era of movie tends to be, but The riffs are amazing, and I think more importantly that the segments are really fun. And I haven't had this for a while where I just like laughed out loud at something that MST3K was doing. Sorry, first 4 episodes in the sci-fi era. I had some chuckles, but no guffaws.
Mm-hmm.
But I did guffaw at 2 moments, the legendary camera 3 bit.
Camera 3, get off the track. Camera 3, oh dear God!
And I think Crow's impression of Jack Elam, like I just started guffawing, especially he's like, and I'm going to make that weird noise he makes.
All of the sketches are so great. I love, also there's this great Joel fake out ending that is frequently done in his time on the show that is done so great in the What a Pleasant Journey song, where it's like, guys, we can't do a song like this. We're not hobos. We're actually guys who live in cars, and they just play the first couple of notes of that riff before going to commercial. It's like, oh, well, we could have an ending for this sketch, but wouldn't it be better if we just had a non sequitur? And the riffs are especially strong. Like, I love when, I guess they're in Lover's Lane. I love when Bix and Carrie are on their first date, I believe, and they start kissing, and one of them pipes in with, "Ooh, you smell like hash browns." And I'm also a big fan of the line later on where Bix shows up to the Den of Ill Repute, and the line is, "Once again, Bix prevents Danny from having another heterosexual experience."
Yeah, and we will go into that a little bit later.
Mm-hmm. But this is really good. This is like, for me anyway, I was like thinking about it, this is like a top 10 ep. And I think a lot of it is because the riffs are great. The movie is actually, I thought, kind of fun to watch. It's very well acted.
Mm-hmm.
And it's shot in a boring TV movie way that fits the not so inspired material. And the sketches are great.
Yeah, indeed. I think that this is a good one for maybe not to start with, but it's a solid one for people who have picked up what MST3K is about. But I'm a self-critical person, Adam, and okay. So I have to admit, like, there's this one sketch in this, I think it's segment 3, where Tom and Crow, inspired by the movie, try to trick Joel into an alley so they can beat him up.
Yes.
Which parallels very strongly what happens in a segment in The Leech Woman, which is inspired by the movie. Crow and Tom try to lure Mike into getting his head chopped off so they can get his neck juices. Mm-hmm. And I remember being really turned off of that premise when I watched it in The Leech Woman. But here, it's really cute and fun.
Yeah.
And is that an inconsistency on my part? Is it because I feel nostalgia for this episode, whereas I don't for the other one? And I think it has to go down to dynamics. Mm-hmm. Like here, Joel's the one in charge, and Crow and Servo are ostensibly his children, and they get a little wayward, and then he has to correct them. So he's not going to be tricked by them, right? And they're not doing it because they're evil. It's because they're goofy kids, basically, who want to imitate what they saw on TV.
Yeah, they're not putting Joel through any serious harm.
Yeah. Whereas with Mike, because they have so much contempt for him, and the hierarchy has been kind of overthrown in the sci-fi era, it actually just feels like this is a continuation of how much they hate Mike and just want him to die. And I don't like that. And it's just so funny how, like, it's essentially the same sketch, but the dynamics around it make it so different for me.
Yeah, and in fact, this even reminds me of, well, a couple of things. One, you mentioned how much you disliked Mike's role, particularly in the sci-fi era, as the whipping boy of the Satellite of Love, and I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a bad one. And here...
Humans are the natural masters.
Yeah.
That is my strong feeling.
As well they should be. I'm sorry, sentient Roombas out there, and that one robot, Azimo, who tried to climb stairs and always falls down. But yeah, the bots here, and I guess to repeat myself from the anniversary special, you can have a darker edge to any of the sketches as long as that family sweetness is there, because that's sweet and salty. That's what MST3K is at. That's where it's at its best, tone-wise, I think. And I would also say, too, it's like, that Pineal sketch from 802 would have worked had it been, Crow versus Tom or Tom versus Crow, because no one would have gotten hurt. And here, like, the belly button sketch is... done that way too. It's like they're not trying to drill something into Joel, which would have been horrible. And here, the wacky fun-loving vibe of all the characters comes through, because Joel initially freaks out. I love the little bit of business that he was doing laundry, so he tosses his laundry basket when he sees that Crow is drilling into Tom.
Yeah.
And he freaks out and he thinks it's a terrible idea. And it's like, oh, but what are we going to do if we're ever in the locker room? What will the other boys say about us? And Joel thinks about it and he goes, duh, okay. And they start drilling into each other. It's great. It's so wacky. Everything seems to have a kind of Saturday morning cartoon logic, which again, I think that's where this show operates at its best.
Mm-hmm. No Gypsy, though. I would have liked to see more Gypsy in these segments.
Well, she's busy driving. You know how Gypsy is responsible for all of the functions, all the higher functions on the ship there. So she is stressed out and always working. Beth, have you ever been a hobo, or have you known a hobo? Or have you ever loved a hobo?
I don't know if I've ever met a hobo, because it doesn't mean what I always kind of thought it meant, which is basically like a drifting tramp. Hobos have always wanted to distinguish themselves from bums, as they put it. They were transient workers, basically. They just went to wherever the job was.
Yeah, they were the working poor.
They were the working poor, and that they had an entire code, and for a while they were almost kind of unionized nationally. So this idea of that I always imagined, like the kind of clown with a bindle, was not really at least what self-identified hobos would associate themselves with. They were just working men, usually, who went where the jobs were, and the way they did that was by riding the rails.
And what's interesting, I was reading this great book, and there'll be a link in the show notes, that's called Rolling Nowhere by Ted Conover. And he goes into the history of like freight hopping, and he decided the best way to learn about the hobo is to become a hobo.
Mm.
So he decided to freight hop and talk to everybody that he met. And there are some interesting things, because essentially in this reprinted version of the book that I read, which came out in early 2001, the lifestyle was going away.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason posited for this, well, there's a couple of things. One is consolidation. Like, basically, there were different railways even as late as the 80s when the first version of the book was published. And now there's a monopoly on everything. Like, as of the writing the intro for the new version, Canadian National had acquired Wisconsin Central, and also Union Pacific Railways had absorbed almost everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it became more of a business. And another super interesting thing, like in previous times, people had a familial link to hobos in one way or another. They either had someone in the family who rode they either had someone in the family who rode the rails for a while. They rode no whales, I guarantee it. But the people knew hobos, or because they had lived through the Great Depression, they knew what it was like to be the working poor. So a lot of hobos who spoke to Conover told him that most of the time, railway staff were cool with it.
Mm-hmm.
They had basically one rule: don't get caught. And if you get caught, we're going to ask you to leave, and then we're going to turn our backs for a minute, and you have that slim window to get back on the train. Like, people were pretty open about it, and even when hobos were spotted hopping freights, they weren't ratted on, whereas as of 2001, like, citizens who happened to witness someone trying to hop a freight would call in and report it.
Yeah.
And Conover says that, or Conover believes that that's because people didn't have that relationship with the poor or with hobos at that time. It seems so far removed, and also changing attitudes about working class and lower class people, where they're seen as alien to us or not working hard enough, unlike good, proper middle class people.
Well, that's what is really interesting about the brief research I did for this. So my two sources are this. One of them is an online source from Collectors Weekly by Lisa Hicks, and the other one was a more academic source called Citizen Hobo by Todd DePasito. And the Hicks piece, she actually went to speak to a whole bunch of hobos, and so she has a much more kind of, I would say, a very sympathetic kind of perspective on it, whereas the DePasito one is more academic and a little bit more distant and just kind of thinking about social trends. But both of them kind of point out that it wasn't just, a way of living, it was a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of, perfectly well-to-do people like Ernest Hemingway would occasionally ride the rails because it was considered a more romantic alternative to middle-class life and the hegemony of it.
On a personal level, one of the things that attracted me to acting for my brief career as a failed actor was the appeal of traveling to different places, looking for jobs, and not always knowing where you're going to end up. Like, the hobo lifestyle was as appealing to me as being a character actor, which is why I initially vied for being a Jack Elam type.
So I have a quote here from the De Pastino that hobos had a countercultural solidarity as workers who scoffed at middle-class values. And they demonstrated like their manliness basically by challenging bosses who demanded submission or insulted their independence and autonomy. So, there's a sense that you're finding an alternative to a kind of capitalist way of living. And this film kind of points that out, is that it's very interpersonal, right? You have to rely on one another. The Hicks piece has a really interesting story about hobo jungles, which were like basically encampments on the edge of town. And if you're going to stay there, the idea was you had to bring something for the soup pot. The collective soup pot, or stew pot, I guess it was called. Like there's always this sense that you were helping each other and contributing to a collective goodness there. And if you didn't follow the rules, they throw you out on your ear.
Yeah, that's totally what I read too in Conover's book. Because when he wanted to hitch with hobos, he could, and everyone was open to it. But his first task was to bring something for the stew pot. And they tasked him with going to somebody's house and asking for salt. That was it. That was his minimal task. And he was scared to do it. And it's weird. It seems so silly, but it's totally relatable. Like if I wanted to be a hobo and they're like, Adam, your first task is to knock on somebody's door and ask for something, like you're a sexy lady asking for a cup of sugar in a movie. Like it seems so impossible because you never do it. And so he is really scared to do it, but some stoner answers the door at 2 a.m. He's like, yeah, you can have salt. And then he leaves. It was very easy. And they ate stew out of the stew pot, which the salt helped flavor. And the plates they had were those little styrofoam trays that you see in supermarkets that they pack vegetables and meat on.
There's something to be said about what you were mentioning about how the working poor have become alien to us, because as someone pointed out, like it was very normal to just go door to door just to ask for small things.
Yeah.
If you did that now, you'd probably, especially in America, you get shot. You would absolutely get shot. So there was this kind of collectivist experience that doesn't, for various reasons, exist anymore. So I can see why it gets romanticized, but it should also be pointed out this was a very male and very white thing to do, and it was a lot harder for other people to live that way because they weren't considered to be part of this collectivist group.
Well, I remember just from the Conover book, the one hobo of color that he speaks to did not want to go door to door, especially in broad daylight, and said, no, it's much easier for me to get around at night.
I think in the Hicks piece, she points it out that yes. Oh, here it goes. Accordingly, many black men who would be outcasts among outcasts wouldn't try riding the rails out of fear of racial violence, while many white hobos refused to work for checkerboard crews that included African-American employees.
Huh.
Yeah.
Lousy hobos. Hobos. We know how big hobos can get. They can get as large as you and I, Beth. But what about the tiniest vagrant? What about the weest of transients? What about the littlest hobo? He's a dog, by the way.
The classic Canadian show, The Littlest Hobo.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be familiar to our American listeners, but it was on all the time when we were kids, and I never watched it because I didn't like live action. I thought hobos were scary.
Well, I understand that. What about a tiny hobo? Or is that scarier that one might like jump in your pocket and follow you home?
Was he a German Shepherd?
He was. That was London.
Oh, you actually remember? Were there different hobos?
Well,
hobo dogs?
There's 2 Littlest Hobo series. It started with a 50s, 60s Canadian series called The Littlest Hobo, and it spun off to the more popular 70s, 80s Littlest Hobo. I have fond memories of character actors showing up going, I'm an alcoholic and I don't know what I'm going to do. Well, I'm going to listen to this dog. Dog, can you help me get back with my wife? The dog barks and asks for a pork chop. He's like, hey, I'm going to start living my life. Thanks, dog. And the dog jumps back on the rails. And that's literally every episode. But, you had cool actors like Simon Oakland showing up. So it was a pretty rad show.
So what you're describing is basically Touched by an Angel, but with a dog that rides the rails.
Isn't that better than Della Reese and Roma Downey?
No.
Yes, it's way better. You got this dog as opposed to like Roma Downey shows up or Della Reese, and occasionally the Angel of Death who looks like Fabio. This is what I remember from Touched by an Angel. And, nothing would happen. Not even when Death would show up. Death would be sad. Everyone would just be dour and be like, oh, you should be thinking about babies. Don't get married and have a nice life. And Della Reese would say whatever Della Reese says.
Well, I mean, I would agree. If heavy-handed Christianity is not your thing, then you should probably stick with The Littlest Hobo.
Yeah, if I want heavy-handed Christianity, I am sticking with Highway to Heaven, thank you very much. But Littlest Hobo has a special connection to this movie.
Why is that?
That's because the director of this film, a young man by the name of Charles Rondo, not to be confused with Charles Rondo Hatton, he directed the movie that was the basis for both series. He directed The Littlest Hobo.
How do you get that?
Yeah.
You're just like, I'm the director who does transient movies. I know how to shoot trains.
Yeah, we've got some more interesting stuff about Rondo, but we're saving that for the show 15.
So I wanted to spend a little time on the relationship between Bix and Danny, because there's two different ways you can read this, I think. Number one comes out very much in the Hicks article that I was talking about, is that this is how people got along in hobo circles. It was very community-minded, and you relied on other people to kind of show you the ropes and help you survive. And so this is a very probably faithful example of the kind of mentor-protege relationships that get developed in these kinds of scenarios. The other reading, and might be one that we are now projecting onto this movie, is that Bix is a seducer who is trying to seduce Danny into a homosexual relationship and also a life of drifting, and just basically rejecting not only a middle-class lifestyle, but heterosexuality.
This would be a fascinating movie had it been made with, I really don't want to say hobosexuality as a metaphor for homosexuality, but it'd be interesting to say it's like, well, it's more free to not have anyone know who I really am, so I can pursue the kind of loves that I want.
Mm-hmm.
And, you get involved with sweet, good-natured Carrie to keep up appearances, but you're really with Danny. But then there's also like the sinister part of that. It's like, well, wait, if if Bix is a gay character, then he's grooming this young man, and that's very creepy.
Yeah, and so it has this kind of almost prison relationship feel about it. Like, and we should say that the prison rape is like, it doesn't happen nearly as much as people think, but the myth of it and the way it works seems to be something that's going on here, possibly, if you wanted to read it that way. And my one source for this, the Citizen Hobo book, has an entire chapter on homosexuality in the hobo world. And he talks about how this was a well-established relationship. The jockers were basically, if you want to put it, the tops. Mm-hmm. And they would find punks, which is actually what punk used to mean, was basically a feminine homosexual. It's interesting how that term has changed. But it also goes into the point where masculinity, especially for working class people, was not necessarily aligned with heterosexuality. It was more about developing as a man, and part of that was being, establishing a hierarchy and getting into fights. And so manliness was something you earned, and it wasn't necessarily something you earned by being with a woman.
Yeah.
And I've got a quote here. For workers, masculinity or manliness derived not so much from sex or the sex of sexual partners, but rather from gender status. That is, the bundles of attributes, values, and behaviors believed to be desirable or normal in men. So that kind of goes hand in hand. Like, workers who scoffed at middle-class values also were men who rejected feminine manners and morals. So it often was just rejecting women entirely, or having very brief relationships with them, a la, the local whorehouse.
Well, it's interesting, like with Bix, because I find that reading interesting, and like I said, I think there would have been a really cool movie had it been made in around this time, using like hobos and being a transient as a metaphor for being bisexual or being homosexual or being openly sexual. But it's not, I don't think it's here, and I think a lot of it is because Bix is so straight in all
Yes.
senses of the word. I mean, don't get me wrong, whoever's playing Danny comes across as the ultimate power bottom. but Bix, the actor who plays Bix, like, it plays it straight, no pun intended. And he also, I have to say, like, going with the performances in the movie, which I think are actually pretty strong, like, his love for Carrie seems really real. And it seems more of a confusion about not knowing what to do and abandoning the life that he clearly likes more than a potential suburban dream of getting married to someone that you care about. That is like the real conflict for the later pointless murder in the movie.
Well, that brings up another issue. So if I think you're right, it's maybe a bit of a stretch. Like, there's certainly things you can be like, oh, he's totally like ruining him, and a more immature reading. But definitely, what is happening here is some version of what we've discussed before, Eva Sedgwick's idea of the homosocial love triangle. And so I'm just going to read this because I think, like, for this movie, it makes so much sense. So the idea is that it defines male homosociality as a form of male bonding with a characteristic triangular structure. In this triangle, men have intense but non-sexual bonds with other men, and women serve as the conduits through which those bonds are expressed. So she points out that as a result, the woman just becomes a conduit. She's more of a mediator than an actual character, and she often becomes gradually obliterated. And what I find so interesting about the movie is the way it ends, that Carrie has done her job. She's tamed Bix. And so she's not needed anymore. And instead, where does he go? He goes to live with Danny and his dad, you know?
Yeah, I see that. Plus, there is the rather unfortunate scene, which is deleted from the MST3K version of the movie, in which Bix lays his eggs so that little hobos can actually eat Carrie from the inside out.
Oh boy. And it's funny because that's something in the Amazing Colossal Episode Guide. This particular entry is really well done, and it's mostly by Paul Chaplin. I'm going to quote here. I'm quoting a lot of things today. He says, "We've done worse movies, but I can't think of one that pissed me off as much. The waitress Carrie is one of the sweetest characters we've ever had. And while Big's hesitation is maybe dumb, he's clearly headed towards a decision to stay with Carrie when she's murdered. Carrie's death is infuriating and not justified by the character's actions and decisions." So he's kind of pushing against the idea, like, this makes no sense. But, you know, if you're thinking about it from Sedgwick's perspective, it makes perfect sense. She's done what she's supposed to do, so she's not needed anymore at a certain point.
And, of course, with the prostitutes in the movie, they are just there to make money. They're there to game Danny. In a way, they're no different than hobos. And one of the things I did like about the movie is that, or at least from what we saw in this edited version, is that while one of them is seen taking some extra money from Danny because he was asleep, I think that's fair game. You're just taking extra money from a rube. Danny is clearly a rube. He's a mark. Of course you would. That's all fair in the game.
He's a pigeon.
Yeah. You got to pluck that pigeon.
I have to say, I really love the prostitute in the bathtub. She's awesome.
Yeah.
You waiting for a bus?
She had, it has to be said, a kind of a Mamie Van Doren quality.
She very much did. I don't know. She was just like from a whole other movie. It's just like, what are you doing here, Jane Mansfield? This is a depressing movie about broken people. We're not supposed to have any glamour in this movie.
Yeah, there is a fun proto best little whorehouse in Texas going on here. Yeah, I would have gladly watched that actress in more things. But at the very least, you know, they did honor her by making her scene the stinger at the end of the episode.
Indeed.
Beth, it's time for a new corner, and it's a corner that's good for everybody because you only need one eye to look at it. It's Character Actor Corner.
Oh, Adam.
What? I'm honoring the great Jack Elam, and just as Crow did in that sketch in segment 4.
So I don't know anything about Jack Elam. Was he somebody who got a lot of work back in the day?
My God, yes. Jack Elam was a bad guy's bad guy. Yeah, he got his start in Westerns in the 50s. And in fact, I think he even goes back to the early 40s. But what's interesting is that I mentioned his eye, not to make fun, but it's actually how he got into this line of work, unsurprisingly. He had no interest in acting at first. Jackie Lamb was an auditor for a film studio.
Really? An auditor?
Yeah. So he was dealing largely with accounts. He was dealing strictly with finances, but his eye was giving him trouble. And of course, the reason Jackie Lamb has that wall-eyed look is because a classmate of his, when he was a little boy, jabbed his eye with a pencil.
My God.
Resulting in, honestly, one of the best faces in film. I love Jackie Lamb.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a great face. I mean, and sometimes this happens. Like, as much as you don't want to point out that somebody looks odd, like this is a lot of the ways people get careers in Hollywood because of the way they look.
Not to mention, I, as you know, worship at the altar of the patron saint of character actors, Donald Pleasance. But I think that having such a striking appearance, you end up having this extra tool set to play with. I mean, similarly, another actor who in this case was missing an eye was Peter Falk, and he definitely played that to his advantage when he became Columbo.
Mm-hmm.
And also, there seems to be a particular thing with character actors, particularly from the 50s onwards, who had a fun-loving and rambunctious nature. See also Donald Pleasance. And I turned this photo of Jackie Lamb to you, which will be in the Slack, and it'll be in our show notes, continuing the proud tradition of Adam shows Beth a thing on this podcast. This photo, I think, encapsulates why Jackie Lamb seems like a great person to hang with.
Whoa.
Doesn't he look like the grooviest uncle?
He is much older than in this movie, and he's let his beard go, and he's smoking a ciggy, and he looks real happy.
And that seemed to be Jackie Lamb's overall demeanor. There's a great interview, which will also be in our show notes, with David Letterman. Letterman, like me, seems to have a real respect and fondness for old, hardened character actors. And Elam is great and really fun-loving and is proud of being like, yeah, I'm a hard-drinking character actor. We don't drink it all during the day. We have a couple of whiskeys at noon. Then at 5, if the shoot is still going, we get fucking tanked. So Jackie Lamb, he got his start in Westerns. He was the villain in a film called The Sundowners. And it was here that he actually made his move. He really enjoyed acting despite never setting out to be an actor. And he got that first major role in a film called The Sundowners because he basically turned to them and said, listen, I can help you raise money for this movie and get your finances in order. Just put me in the movie. I got this face. And it worked out.
Wow.
And he proved to be a good actor. But what's funny, so he started showing up in as the bad guy, which is a role he relished. And for him, being typecast was no problem. And it's probably because he had no interest in acting at first. So the idea that he was Jack Elam, brand name villain, he thought that was great. He thought that was job security. He brags on his Letterman appearance when talking about a movie called Rawhide. He goes, I shot a little baby to make her dance. Then I moved on to some really dirty stuff. Talking about his roles. He's great. And he even boasts about shooting all of the heroes in the backs in his movies. He's like, it's the only place to shoot them. And Jackie Lamb was such a face that by the 1970s, he had been used in so many things. He had even been used in an episode of The Twilight Zone that's called Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up? Where again, his looks are used as a kind of comical signal to the audience of something's not right here. Jack Elam is in this cafe. And what's funny is that he had, I mentioned that he was an auditor before, he had a mathematical approach to acting that ended up biting him in the ass. In the early days, he used to count the lines he had to know if he had a good part or not.
Oh, that's not how that really works, does it?
No. And he later made the biggest mistake as he was growing in Hollywood and becoming more and more successful. He was offered a part and he counted the lines. He's like, I only have 22 lines of dialogue in this movie. But in the last movie I did, I had 26 lines of dialogue. I must turn down this part. That part was the villainous role in Shane, which made Jack Palance a star.
Well, but then we wouldn't have Jack Palance, so.
Yeah, that's true. And Outlaw of Gore is every bit the classic as Girl in Lover's Lane. So you know what? It all worked out.
You seem to know a lot about Jack Elam, and I'll admit I don't, but I have something else to contribute, and that is the Amazing Colossal Episode Guide, which actually has a monster entry by Trace Beaulieu.
About Jack Elam?
About Jack Elam. Okay, here we go. Kingdom, animal, Genus, Homo. Species, Sapiens. AKA, Jack Elam. Special powers, facial contortionist. Weakness, self-confession.
Well, Trace seems to have an extreme fondness for Elam. Certainly Crow does. And although the Jack Elam sketch to me reeks of Frank Conniff's writing, and I say that as a huge compliment. But on the note, because we've talked a bit about, a level of saltiness on MST3K, how much is too much, that sort of thing. And how did you find the Jack Elam sketch here?
Fine. Because he's not making fun of Jack Elam, really. Like, he's mentioning him by name, but it's about the creepy weirdo he's playing, right?
I agree. This is a celebration of Elam.
Yeah. So I did not find anything untoward about it because Jack Elam himself was playing up specific features in order to create a very, very creepy person. Which, by the way, is this just because this movie is bad, or is this what the 50s was like? If someone who's a bit weird was pawing at women all the time, we'd just be like, oh, he's just a weirdo. Don't worry about it.
Well, that's the question. Is he pawing at her because he's a weirdo and he's ostracized? Or is he ostracized because he's always pawing at Carrie? It's never made clear. No,
nobody seems to have a problem with it, especially in this town. And it just reminds me about growing up, if you had creeps or pedophiles around, I just remember the story from my youth. If you got touched by him, you'd be blamed. Like, you should know better, kid.
Yeah.
Stay away from that weirdo. It was more your fault for getting near somebody who was a known deviant, basically.
Yeah. This is why the slogan was always, don't talk to strangers, instead of, I think the more worthy, pedophiles f*** off.
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
Oh yes, it's time for the Shallow 13. 13 fun facts about this episode of MST3K and its gloomy movie, The Girl in Lover's Lane. Go Beth, go!
This isn't Big Stupid's first appearance on It's Just a Show. Remember a few weeks ago we covered MST3K Season 8, Episode 1, Revenge of the Creature? Actor Brett Halsey has a small role in Creature as one of two hapless doofs who find an unconscious Dr. What's-Her-Name on the shore, only to be gutted by Gillman.
Despite sharing screen time with the great Gillman, Halsey is perhaps best remembered for his work on the celebrated 90s Canadian cartoon series X-Men, based on the Marvel comic of the same name. He played Bolivar Trask, yes, Bolivar, the creator of the biggest, stupidest robots of them all, the mutant hunting Sentinels.
The Girl in Lover's Lane was the second screenplay by Joe Hyams, who would later write the tense and much better script for the Clint Eastwood thriller Play Misty for Me.
Director Charles Rondo specializes in two things: getting decent performances from the cast and filming mostly in close-ups. Rondo's reliance on tight, even shots and his ease with actors led to decades of work directing virtually every TV show in America. Highlights from his CV include Mission Impossible, Beretta, Kojak, The Munsters, The Partridge Family, Love, American Style, and The Adam West Batman.
As Paul Chaplin notes in the Amazing Colossal Episode Guide, the town of Sherman has a, quote, insupportable prostitute-to-male ratio. He goes on, granted the cost of living in Sherman is perhaps not that high, but just to meet fixed costs, it seems like each prostitute would have to accommodate each male Shermanite, well, a lot. Plus, there being so few purchasers, the males could easily organize and demand the very lowest rates. I guess what I'm saying is if I were a prostitute, I'd go somewhere else.
On a later note, the many Carrie You're So Very riffs are a reference to an insufferable ad campaign for Carrie skin lotion.
Carrie is so very
different. It doesn't feel like ordinary lotion.
Link in the show notes.
On a darker note, as Jack Elam's character leers at Carrie, Crow compares him to the formerly genial Minnesota Public Radio host Garrison Keillor.
As a young man, Garrison Keillor was shunned by his friends.
That's a weirdly prescient joke there.
What is that familiar tune Tom is humming when Big Stupid and Carrie go on their date? It's Gerald Fried's love theme titled Second Ruth, composed for the classic Star Trek episode Shore Leave. Like most memorable new compositions for the show, it would be temp-tracked and recycled in countless episodes.
Also, Crow's Leonard Nimoy impression,
I like it here on Omicron Ceti 3 Gym,
is a reference to classic Trek tale, The Paradise Syndrome. The off-reference episode is the one where a flower ejaculates special pollen onto Spock, which turns him into a laughing, loving, lazy hippie.
As Big Stupid starts his game of pinball, Tom says,
I am Xenon, play me.
Xenon was a 1980 pinball game with a theme of sexy lady robots. The sexy lady robot voice that Tom imitates was provided by Susan Ciani, who also composed the electronic soundtrack. We'll put a link in our show notes to a great clip of David Letterman interviewing Ciani on his short-lived morning show.
Tom compares Carrie's friend Peggy to Lydia Lunch.
There's no such animal.
What is she, Lydia Lunch over here?
Lunch is a fiercely independent writer and musician who fronted Teenage Jesus and The Jerk. She was given her name because when she was a teenager, she had a habit of stealing food for her friends. Her teenage delinquency seems to have worked out for her in the long run.
In one scene, Peggy starts to dance, and we cut to a close-up of her shimmying butt, which Tom refers to as Two Moon Junction. Two Moon Junction was a Zalman King softcore smutfest starring Twin Peaks' Sherilyn Fenn. There, the Two Moon Junction was definitely code for Fenn's butt.
From our other science facts department, did you know that Joel's egg trick in segment 4 really works? If you heat up a narrow-tipped glass container and place a hard-boiled egg to cover its spout, the depleting oxygen will create a vacuum that will suck down a hard-boiled egg. Science!
And that's time.
So, Adam, I don't usually like invention exchanges all that much, but I have to admit that the one here interested me for 2 reasons, because it brought up themed sports nights, which are always fun, and Mad Magazine, which I hadn't thought about in a very long time.
Yeah, that's true. Mad Magazine is something that has more or less vanished from the public consciousness. But first, sports nights. And I have to say, what's weird about the sports nights pitched by the Mads is that they're actually not that far removed from some of the terrible, terrible sports nights that have been around, Beth.
And we should clarify, we're not just talking sports nights, we're talking promotional tie-ins that happen with a sports event. The classic being bobbleheads of the players.
Mm-hmm. And, of course, we're not talking about the dreadful sitcom Sports Night by Aaron Sorkin. Do not consume Aaron Sorkin products.
No, we're talking about, for instance, Towel Night.
Now, what was Towel Night?
The Jays do it a lot. You just get a towel with the logo on it, and you're supposed to just spin it around in the seats in order to make something kind of distracting and fun to look at. Theme nights are tough because it has to be something relatively cheap, but that's people still want, and also something that can't turn into a projectile because fans are terrible.
Right, and no one has ever been hurt by a towel.
Exactly.
Someone brings a bunch of oranges. No bruises, Beth. One of the ones I read up about was Toilet Seat Night. Which is true. There was a team called the Hudson Valley Renegades, and they decided that the best possible promotion was that they would give away to the first 3,000 fans a free toilet seat. This was not their first foray into poopery, as the previous year they had given away a plunger.
Boy. Usually this stuff seems to happen in the minor leagues because they have a little bit more trouble bringing people in. But I think my favorite is from the Seattle Mariners. Free compost night.
See, this is not far removed from poopy nights.
But you know how it went wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not in the way you imagine.
Everyone ate their compost?
No, the compost wasn't very good.
Oh.
The compost was made out of trash collected from the stadium.
Oh.
So it was made of mostly like hot dogs and peanut shells. So it wasn't very good. It wasn't that, I thought when you're talking about compost that is a really great thing to throw at the rival team.
Yes.
No, it was just bad compost.
One of them that I saw was a speed dating night. Can you imagine? Take the awkwardness of dating, then amplify it for speed, but then throw in baseball on top of it. It's like trying to, it'd be basically like taking your date to a sports restaurant.
I mean, if they're already at a baseball game, you have to assume that they like it, right?
Yeah, but wouldn't you be there for the game and not for the love of romantic games?
Okay, was this a baseball game?
Yes, it was.
Yeah. As somebody who now is married to a fan, you have to understand how baseball works. Baseball is slow. You don't have to pay a lot of attention. In fact, it's actually good if you have something to do while you're watching it.
I suppose that's true. The one slow event that I can recall going to that had a speed dating element to it is that a woman I was sitting next to at a production of Cirque du Soleil once got real handsy with me while we were watching Allegria.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Were you harassed?
Is it harassed if you reciprocate afterwards? But it was like,
Okay.
it was not motivated. I wasn't like, hey, we both like clowns. It was totally out of nowhere. This lady was, rifling my hog.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it was nice. And
right.
we had a lovely tour of the public washroom a little later in that event.
Wait a minute. just like put down another couple who did the same thing while you were taking a break in a different public washroom?
No, sure. But listen, I mean, when you see French clowns, the thing that does to the human libido, I mean, you can't control it. It's got to be acted upon.
At least it wasn't a library washroom.
I mean, my God, that's filth. Now, the other part of the invention exchange, the Doc Martin boots. Do you have much of a memory of either Mad or any of its competitors, like Cracked or Crazy or Stupid or Goofball or whatever the hell else there was?
Oh, yes. I was a huge Mad Magazine fan back when I was a kid-ager. I thought they were really funny, and I get them out at the library all the time. But then I also thought Garfield comics were funny, so...
I was the same way, and you know what? Garfield only really holds up if it's, voiced with the dulcet tones of Lorenzo music in those specials. Barring that one where he raps. But I had this weird thing reading Mad. I wonder if you felt the same way. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the parodies, and I got the kind of far-flung humor and pop culture humor of it. I tapped into that. But at the same time, I also got the sense, much like this is how it must be for kids growing up with The Simpsons now, as like, oh, this is a thing that used to be amazing that I'm just getting access to. And it's all right, I suppose. It's something I can spend my lunch money on.
Yeah, I don't know. My feeling at the time was, this is still funny, but I think that this format is getting old. Whatever they did that was so good, it's not working so much anymore, especially with Don Martin. Now, his look... It was just very 70s. And by the time I was watching in the 90s, it was really showing its age. And I, didn't really like it. And that time, Mad Magazine was starting to move into bringing in new artists, younger artists who were trying to appeal to a different demographic. The Don Martin has a very National Lampoon feel about it, kind of like college skirt chasers, whereas at the time they were bringing in new artists who I think were trying to appeal to younger teenage boys.
I'll say this. There are some incredible artists, and this is why I'd love to get my hands on a good collection of kind of the best of Mad, and I'm sure there's quite a few of them out there.
Oh, yeah, there definitely is. And I agree, there's some really good artists there, and I forget the one guy who I loved. He tended to work on the parodies, but some really talented stuff there.
Yes, not to mention, you had the great Sergio Aragones, who would draw Gru the Wanderer and had this wonderful cartoony style, and he'd always draw weird stuff in the margins.
Right.
He was exceptionally good. One of my favorite artists who would have been before my time, but is a comic book artist I adore, is a fellow by the name of Basil Wolverton. And he specialized in drawing grotesques and caricatures. And he has a famous Mad cover that some people found too scary.
Oh.
And I will share that with you. So again, we turn our eyes to the Slack as I upload the Mad cover where they try to find the hot babe to grace that cover, and you get this by Basil Wolverton. This incredibly detailed.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is kind of a famous cover, but care to describe that for the listeners at home?
It's really focused on the teeth. It's basically like a really grotesque cartoon, almost in a Crummian kind of vein, but really emphasizing a giant gaping maw with Lisa needs braces kind of teeth. She looks like you could tour around the South and charge 2 bits a gander.
Yes, and this woman is made all the more horrifying by the fact that she has like a pig-like snout. There's a lot of wrong going on here, which is what makes it so right, in my view.
I gotta say, not my cup of tea.
Oh, I love this style, man.
Was his heyday in the 70s too? Because it has that kind of feel to it.
No, his heyday, he got started very early on, but yeah, he joined Mad, I believe, in the 50s.
Okay.
And so, yeah, there was nothing like his style around at the time.
Yeah, this would be very new.
Yeah, a lot of publishers were hesitant to publish his work, especially when he was trying to break into comic strips in the 50s, because his work was too extreme.
Yeah, it is very unsettling.
Yes, and Mad also has a very special place in the hearts of all rebellious youth because it's part of the Gaines household. And Gaines, of course, gave us Tales from the Crypt and its various spin-offs, and that's how Mad started. Mad was a comic alternative to Tales from the Crypt that was originally titled Tales to Drive You Mad.
Did not know that.
Yeah. So that was the original slogan for the magazine, and when they originally hired artists like Harvey Kurtzman and Wally Wood and developed its original style. It went through like so many permutations. I think that Mad Magazine, you know what? I don't think the Simpsons analogy, my Simpsons analogy earlier, let's scrap it. It's probably more like an SNL analogy where everyone has their favorite era and knocks the other eras that they didn't grow up with.
Right. That's true, too.
But what's interesting is that you were very right about whether or not it could survive, because Mad folded. But Mad, believe it or not, is back.
Of course.
Yeah, as we're recording this, Mad Magazine just got relaunched. There is a now brand new cover of the new Mad Magazine, which features, what's the Mad kid's name? The Mad mascot.
Alfred E. Newman.
Yes, Alfred E. Newman is picking his nose. And that feels very, very fitting.
That about does it for our ride on the train today. But I understand Chris might have a final factoid for us that he's uncovered.
I sure do. So one final factoid for you guys. Once again, we have a weird name in this episode. Last time we had Nedrick, and we dug up a little bit of the history of the other guy in real life named Nedrick. This time we have Bix. Beth, I bet you know of a famous Bix.
No, it almost sounds like a male version of a short form of my full name, Elizabeth. You can go Busy, so it almost seems like a male shortened version, Bix. Is that it?
And a former love of my life went by Bix Kitty.
Well, I thought you might know because there was a famous jazz musician back in the 1920s named Bix Beiderbecke.
Bix Beiderbecke.
Yeah, he was a cornet player. He was sort of in the league with Louis Armstrong, but he died quite young in 1931. Got a bit of notoriety and then died young and became one of the early jazz legends for, being a person who died young. So he was known by Bix. But what do you think the Bix stood for? It wasn't Elizabeth.
If I were to guess, it would be Bert I. Zordon.
Or maybe a short form of Billy? William?
It is short for Bismarck.
What?
Ah.
Yeah, Leon Bismarck Beiderbecke.
That sounds the name of a Disney villain.
Yes, indeed. Was Bix Dugan named Bismarck Dugan? I don't know.
Oh, that's even worse than Bix Dugan.
Anyway, that's my final factoid. If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you've got great stories of riding the rails, or if you'd like to ask Beth and Adam anything, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com, or we're on Twitter at itisjustashow. We'd love to hear from you. It's Just a Show is a podcast from Megaphonic FM. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. And thanks again to all our Patreon supporters. You guys are great. You help keep us going. And if you're not a supporter already, why, you can become one and access some superfan bonus bits from this episode and from many of our older episodes by going to itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/26.
Well, that train's leaving the station. We say goodbye to the girl in Lover's Lane, which brings to mind this question. What on earth are we going to do to follow up this episode? It better be good.
Well, I'll tell you, I was riding the rails from Ottawa to Oshawa, the 1140. Did I have a ticket? You know I did. Business Plus, quiet a seat on the train. Really lets me hear the rails singing out. And I heard them sing ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. And I realized that what they actually wanted was for us to watch season 6, episode 12, The Starfighters.
Oh my god. Guys, this is in my top 5. How do I get... We've got 2 of my top 5 in the last year. This is amazing.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know that you felt so fondly about this episode. I've never seen this episode.
Oh, how?
I don't know.
What?
Every season, I think there's like a handful of episodes I miss somehow.
I think you're going to enjoy it. Let me just put it that way. I won't oversell it.
Okay.
Is it on Netflix?
No, but it is on Shout Factory's website. So fans, if you want to watch with us, so to speak, or get ahead of the game, why not go to their website? There'll be a link in the show notes for Starfighters.
Thank you, Shout Factory.
Yes, thank you. And God bless Shout Factory.
All right, on that note, until next time.
Keep riding them rails. Keep eating those snails. And keep on telling tales.
And watch out for whales.
We'll see you next time. Take it away, Theme Squad.
Now, you said he died young. Do we know any causes of what sank that Bismarck?